Mai haere mai ki tēnei hui, an exciting briefing on Bill 3. Oh, sorry, no pressure. Over to you, Margot and Jenny.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Madam Chair. That is a very high bar introduction to live up to when we're talking about Bill 3. Fantastic. So thank you all for making the time today. So the purpose of today's briefing is to primarily share with you the joint submission that was made, so joint along with the 4 councils that we are in discussions with at the moment. So it's the joint submission that we made. What we'd like to do is also to highlight some key provisions that are in the draft bill that, if left unchanged, so when the bill is enacted, that they could introduce some operational challenges. And so this is not about trying to scare anybody or anything like that. It's simply highlighting some risks that could be introduced into our environment that we need to think about how do we mitigate. The other opportunity that I would hope this conversation gives us is to understand any concerns from yourselves that perhaps we need to think about and address during the development of the Water Services Delivery Plan and also the implementation planning that feeds into that. So it's a bit of me sharing with you, but also you sharing concerns that we can then give some consideration to. So, just to recap, the Local Water Done Well legislation framework, so there are 3 pieces of legislation. So the first piece of legislation was to repeal the previous government's legislation. The second piece was to introduce the Preliminary Services Arrangements Act, and that really sets a foundation for this piece of legislation. But the Bill 2, the Preliminary Arrangements Act, also introduced the requirement for the development of a WSDP by September. And so that is our current legislation that we are working to. So whilst today we're talking about Bill 3, just do reiterate it is not yet legislation, and so our legislation is that Preliminary Services Arrangements Act. So Bill 3 was introduced in December, end of last year, and as far as we're aware, it is expected to be enacted mid this year. We're assuming that is June. At the moment, a report is scheduled to the Finance and Expenditure Committee on the 17th of June, so that gives us some weight to that mid-year timeframe. What I've provided here is a timeline, just because I'm quite conscious that the Local Water Done Well milestone, so on the slides there, that's the top row, so that has quite a significant overlap to some of the considerations and the decisions that are around establishing an assumed water organisation, but it also in terms of your own elected member activity around election, around induction, around summer recess. And so I thought it might be useful just to provide you that visual timeline so that you can see some of the overlaps. I won't go into that in any great detail, that's just there for your reference. Okay, so Bill 3, it is quite significant, both in terms of the size and scale, but also in terms of the complexity that is contained within it. So you will all be very familiar, I'm sure, with the Local Government Act. So this is bigger than that. It is of a similar size and scale to the RMA. So it is considerable. It is really quite technical. It delves down into a number of operational areas, for example, access to private land, development contributions, as well as talking about the establishment of water organisations. So it goes from quite high level macro governance down into operational level. So I'm not going to read every word on these slides. You'll be very pleased to hear that. But just to give you a sense of what is within Bill 3, so it talks to the structural arrangements, so around how do councils set up and transfer to water organisations or CCOs. It talks to and has provisions for ownership and governance. And as I mentioned, it also addresses operational matters around water charges, entry to private land, trade waste disposal, and so on. Yeah. It then, of course, talks about a matter that I'm sure will be quite dear to your hearts, planning, reporting and financial management. So, as you know, statement of expectations that is required from the owner or owners to issue to the board of a water organisation, their responding water services strategy, an annual budget and, of course, an annual report. And then within the bill is also amendments to other acts and miscellaneous provisions, and that includes, for example, around stormwater and environmental performance. So you've got the Water Services Authority, Taumata Arawai, who are consulting at the moment on those performance standards, and that's a piece of work that we're working on, and we'll bring that draft submission to you at some point very soon. So the bill, as I say, is quite broad in terms of what it covers. It's also very deep in terms of depth of technical information. So I'm going to skip into now the submission. So the submission's closed in mid-February, so the time frame to prepare this was quite tight, given that most people were heading off on a bit of a summer holiday. But we did meet the time frame. The submission was prepared in conjunction with the other councils, as I mentioned, so it was a joint submission, and it was also prepared in conjunction with our iwi partners, so it was a collective effort. In all, our submission also requested that we speak to our feedback, and so Dame Kerry Prendergast, as chair of the Mayoral Forum, spoke to the joint submission. And as I believe, it was very well received. Her submission was very well received. Our submission has it's quite lengthy, so it's about 60-odd pages. Good news, I'm not going to take you through 60 pages of feedback today, but you do have, if you don't have it, you will shortly have that submission in full. There are 7 main themes that were highlighted in the submission, and those are the ones that I'm going to take you through today, just to give you a flavour of those. What I'm going to do is take you through those themes, highlight very briefly what the bill provisions are, what the general gist of our submission feedback was, and then some prompters for you to consider. The prompters, when they come up on screen, are not for us to workshop today through to resolution. They are more food for thought for you to take away and maybe prompt some questions today that we can give some consideration to. In a couple of the submission points, I do talk to that the bill provision is not consistent with previous policy or current legislation. That is not an accusation in any way, shape or form. What I'm looking to highlight to you is that the advice that we have presented to you over the last 6 or 8 months has been based on advice that's been made available to us. And so I'm looking to highlight to you where those differences are coming through. So the first point that we look to make in our submission is really talking to the suite of objectives that the bill provides. The bill provisions talk to water service providers must provide safe drinking water. Water services must be reliable, must act in the best interests of current and future consumers, for example, and meet regulatory standards. They must be, services must be cost effective and financially sustainable, and again, one dear to your heart, I'm sure, perform functions in an open, transparent manner using sound business practice. So that's generally what the objectives talk to. Now, you would say they probably sound largely okay. However, what I do want to highlight is also in the bill are a number of financial principles. The financial principles talk to what must occur. So they are quite definitive, whereas the water services providers' objectives they don't have that word must included in them. So that provides a level of interpretation, and that's what our submission feedback has recommended, is that these objectives would benefit from being strengthened. And if we think about how this might play out in an operational sense, As you know, you have the opportunity to to develop and provide a water organisation with a statement of expectations. If some of these objectives were really fundamental to you as council, and these aren't provided for as a must objective in the legislation, you may then, that may result in you needing to use your valuable statement of expectations to provide that instruction to your provider. So, for example, safe drinking water is what the current wording is. You may actually require safe 3 waters. And so the legislation provides for drinking water, so it would be something you would probably need to explicitly call out in the statement of expectations. Okay, so we're just in that submission really just highlighting that all councils and all providers would benefit from having stronger objectives articulated. The second theme that we identified in feedback is around council influence over the water organisation. Prior to Bill 3 coming out, the advice was that once a council had transferred assets and revenue and debt to a water organisation, largely that was a handover and a hands-off time. What Bill 3 has introduced is the ability for councils to elect to give themselves a level of authority. That authority could be to review and require action on your feedback on the water services strategy, or it could be review, feedback and approve the water services strategy. Okay, so that's quite a different arrangement to what we have talked about previously. If, as the owner or co-owners, you do want that, that would need to be articulated in the Constitution. So it's not something you can decide later on. That is needs to be determined up front. Yep.
Sorry.
Yep.
We're going to do questions at the end.
Cool. So I'll just, yep. The submission does not say that introducing this influence is a good thing or a bad thing. It doesn't form an opinion on that, and I do just want to be clear on that. What we're saying, what the submission talks to is that there is a need to strike a balance between the establishment of a professional board that is articulated for in legislation that requires professional skill set, that requires water expertise. And if we're now saying that councils may have authority over that board, that may impact on the calibre of applicants. It may not be an attractive working arrangement for some professional directors. And that is a consideration that we think needs to be given some time and space to. So again, it's not right, it's not wrong. It's just we need to think about the balance of what would be established with a water organisation. Okay. Thank you. Just pause.
I have got quite a lot of questions
okay,
now.
Do you want to?
Should we do those ones now and then? Yes, we're going all right for time. Councillor McNulty.
Can you just go back to the previous slide, please?
One moment. This one?
Yeah, so you said authority to amend to approve the strategy. You didn't talk about the and budget part, so I'd just like to get some elaboration on the budget part.
That is a quote-unquote from published content, and it only refers to the strategy. So there isn't a mention of the budget. So I don't know if that would extend to the budget. It would definitely impact the budget. So if your feedback on the strategy, if you gave feedback on the strategy, that may then impact on the budget. So there would be a tight relationship there.
So, sorry, just note, and budget though is in this sentence there, approve the strategy and budget.
That will be my typo, whereas on my notes is a copy and paste from the bill. So okay. That will be my typo, my apologies.
Okay, cool, that's quite a...
Let me strike that out.
Substantive change of legislation, so...
Just draw on your screen. All right, Councillor Brown.
So if we are in partnership with the other councils, how will we actually participate in approving or giving us, how will our authority actually extend to the strategy point?
That's an excellent question, which we really haven't delved into deeply, because we are waiting to see where the bill lands and how the feedback that's given from across the councils, whether that's been adopted in the Act itself. So, but if we work on the basis that there is no change to this, then that's something we would have to work through, I imagine, in the Constitution as to how that would work. It would also be similar to how the Statement of Expectations is developed as well. So how do we come together as a group of shareholders to develop up a single set of expectations so that there is one set of expectation, and then the returning single strategy, how is the feedback and the approval given on that as a single set of owners?
I should have noted at the beginning of this session that this is public and live stream, just so you all know. Councillor Free.
If councils are able to have a broad input into the organisation, how does that kind of achieve the goals that we thought we were achieving? It almost sounds like revisiting the status quo in a different guise.
That's a good question, Councillor. And look, I'm not here to defend the draft legislation. I can't do that. What I can do is provide observations and advice based on the conversations we've had amongst our councils and also with DIA. So it does, and this is one of the reasons why I did want to highlight this to you today, because it is different to the advice we have given you previously. So it is something that we would need to consider if the bill went through unchanged.
Can I ask just another one? So we're out consulting with the public on this right now. Isn't this rather a material difference?
Remember, this is a draft legislation, so what we're consulting on at the moment is the known state under the legislation, the Preliminary Services Arrangements Act.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Pannett.
Sorry, just following on from the questions of my two colleagues. So if, for example, we thought they weren't taking stormwater investment enough, in practice we could tell them to lift the investment, if you just look at it on a surface level.
On a surface level, and if in the Constitution collectively you had given yourselves that authority, as my understanding is, yes.
So essentially it would be like having the Wellington Water Committee would meet and go, we want you to put more money into stormwater, and then the board would have to do it?
I believe so.
Sorry, I know you don't know the minds of the government, but do you think they're using this as sort of this provision as a kind of, look, we want you to get water off your books, but we'll still give councils and local communities a bit of a right to have a say? Does the explanatory statement say anything?
It doesn't, but it could be that this is part of the government's approach to ensuring water has that local influence and has that local connection to communities. I don't know, but that could be an assumption.
Deputy Mayor Foon.
Yeah, just the Standard & Poor's. I mean, I know that's one of our things to think about, but would the government have not had a chat with them while they were pulling this together?
Deputy Mayor, I can probably answer that question. So the short answer is very unlikely, because Standard & Poor's would need to have a look at the individual circumstances of each entity. Standard & Poor's have issued some, I guess, discussion papers and the likes, and those indicate the uncertainty of the policy environment that is facing local authorities at the moment, and so they're very uncertain around water reform, and they can't be categoric about a policy process until they have the hard facts. So that was one of the key reasons for the recent downgrade that we had, because the uncertain policy environment that we're operating in, and they're not seeing, that as clearly as they perhaps need to be to get confidence in either our credit, rating, or for our credit rating, and they can't be categoric about anything in the abstract either.
All right, that's the end of the questions. Shall we carry on with the presentation? Thank you, Margot.
Thank you. So the next theme is around defining relationship expectations with iwi Māori. So the bill provides for the water services providers to establish and maintain opportunities, which is fine, great. And it also makes provision for water service providers to be consistent with treaty settlement obligations. So again, good. Where our submission feedback focused is really around if a council decides that water services are retained in-house versus setting up a water organisation, there is now an inconsistency with how this provision would be enacted. And so it really would mean one set of rules for a council who are delivering services in-house versus one set of rules for a water organisation. And so you have vast inconsistencies across that. The submission also talks to our request or our feedback that the board of a water organisation really needs to acknowledge Te Tiriti and Te Mana o Te Wai outcomes. And we think those are a fundamental set of skills that a board should have given the subject of water. What I have drawn your attention to there, just at the bottom of the screen on the elected member takeaways, is just remembering for our council that we have our Tākai Here agreement. We also have our Tūpiki Order strategy, which supports our Māori-led response to uplifting the state of wellbeing of whānau, and that includes relationships between people, place and nature. So it's not as if our council has nothing in this space, but we do need to think about if the bill remains unchanged, what does that mean for our relationships? What does it mean with how we work with other councils in these relationships? And having our Tākai Here agreement and Tūpiki Order is a great start, and how could we best leverage those? So again, this is just something to highlight to you of what's in the bill and what our submission talked to. Privatisation. Good news is, well, I might jinx it, but I'm pretty sure this one will be fairly quick because it's quite a narrow focus. So the advice that we have been working to and that remains in place today is there is a government commitment for water infrastructure to remain in public ownership. There is a provision in the bill that where the water organisation is owned by shareholders of a cooperative company, they may apply to DIA to be exempt. Okay, so there is an element of privatisation. Our submission says that that's not consistent with previous government policy, and that we recommend that it is consistent throughout and that that provision is removed. So our assessment is that there is no immediate impact on the work that we have done to date or what we plan to do around water services, but again, this is just highlighting that this is what's in there, because I appreciate privatisation has been a topic of interest. Simplification and around reducing complexity and compliance costs. So as I mentioned at the outset, that the bill is incredibly detailed, it is considerable in terms of its expectations, and as I mentioned, it's similar to in size and scale to the RMA. Just as a comparison, the Auckland Water Care legislation has 22 sections specific to water supply. This bill has 200 sections. So what we're saying, what the theme of our submission is, if Watercare is, as we believe, functioning well, is there a need to introduce this level of complexity for other organisations? And we think that largely the LGA should be able to provide the legislation for our water environments. Would need to be some additions, but largely the LGA should be able to do that. So what our main concern here is, if the bill remains unchanged, this could introduce a significant amount of operational complexity and with that cost. And that is something we would really hope to avoid as much as feasibly possible, so that we keep this operation as efficient as possible. The other point I would like to make just at the bottom of the slide there is, given the size and scale of this bill, it really is quite likely to take some time for the operational teams to get to grips with and understand what's required. And so that may just, again, introduce some risk either to the new organisation and or to council while we factor that complexity in. This one is quite an interesting one. So this submission theme talks to the bill provision that says, at the commencement of the Act, and remember at the moment we're working to that being June this year, at the commencement of the Act, where an existing CCO that provides water services, Wellington Water, and that CCO intends to continue providing water services, they will automatically become a water organisation and therefore be subject to the Act. The provision in the bill says, in that circumstance, that new water organisation would be required to enter into a transfer agreement where the TA transfers specified responsibility for providing water services and any specified infrastructure-related assets and other matters. So if we think back to that timeline I shared at the beginning of the discussion today, if the bill is enacted in June, our 6-month window becomes likely, we would assume, end of December. Okay? And so if we think about what's happening in that September, October, November timeframe, that does cause us to think about planning and decision-making points. Now, our submission point talked to that we don't believe the 6 months is a feasible timeframe for that. What we have yet to receive clarification on is, A, the driver for that 6-month requirement. We're not sure what the need for that is. Also, if the provision is talking to having a contract in place, that is one thing. But if it is talking to enacting that transfer, then that's when that 6-month window becomes very challenging. Bearing in mind, in parallel to this, if the preferred consultation option progresses, we would be looking to establish that new water organisation at the same time as meeting this provision. So it's a bit untidy, but as we say, as I've been saying all along, this is draft legislation, and so this may not come to fruition.
Margo, how many more slides do you have? I have a few questions now, but
Oops, sorry, I've got two, but I think let's pause and
do
take
those
questions.
ones that we've got. Yeah, Councillor Wineta.
Could you please just flick back to the privatisation slide? So I'm quite confused about the proviso that the organisation can only be owned by either TA singular, TA plural, or a consumer trust with with governors appointed by a TA presumably. What kind of a cooperative company could even be involved in this in a WSP?
Good question.
Okay. Well, it just seems like they very clearly state who can be involved and then kind of make a carve out for someone who can't even be involved. So what? Okay, cool, sweet.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Councillor Pennant.
Yeah, just following on from that. So what is the process by which you'd set up this cooperative? Would it go to referendum? Like, how would...
Councillor, on it, I don't know, and we haven't explored this because very early on we ruled out any of the. So remember, we had 5 delivery model options that were available under the legislation. Under the reform program, and we very quickly ruled out any option that did not provide us access to the increased funding. So we didn't delve into any of the other models in detail to understand it.
But in saying that, under the legislation, you could change it from what might happen to a cooperative.
Sorry, can you work through it again?
So even though one model might be chosen, you could still turn into a cooperative company down the road, but you're just not sure what the process is under the bill. Doesn't say
I don't believe so, but Andrea, were you wanting to?
No, I don't believe that you could do that, because there would be certain things that in the constitution of the entity that would be set up that would prevent that from happening, unless you fully established a whole separate entity and went down a different route. I don't think you could achieve that.
Okay. And the asset transfer, which there are other ways of expressing that. Sorry, just what exact controls are going to stop that happening?
For privatisation?
Yeah, so say someone decided they wanted to put, some councils in the future decided to want to put all their wastewater treatment plants, say just one part of, could they do that?
So that first bullet point up on the slide there, so in the bill there is a provision that says that water organisations, so the CCOs, must be wholly owned by one or more TAs, which is what we're exploring, both of those 2 options.
Okay, so the wholly is important there, so you can't take one part of it off?
No.
Okay, and you can't flick the whole lot off to a private company?
No.
Like sell it off?
No.
Okay.
Councillor McNulty.
Just want to have my facts in the line. So you're saying local water done well, bill free is longer than the RMA in its existing form. So that's correct?
It's give or take. It's comparable, yes. It's, yeah.
Is it, and is it by word count, number of clauses, pages? Like just trying to, if you printed it out, you'd just have 2 relatively equal sizes of paper?
Pretty much. I think I might have. I don't know if I had kept those statistics. So the RMA has 400 plus sections, and this bill has over 400, so not quite the same. And the LGA has just over 300.
Wow. Cool, thank you.
Free.
Yeah, I just wonder if we might be getting a little bit racked up over this, because I'm thinking there could be water organisations that are already private, like, for example, farmers sometimes have water supplies which are on their own land and used for their own purposes, or a collective. So do we know anything more? Have we been given any background to the share? What sort of things might constitute currently a cooperative?
I believe
company?
they sit outside of the definition of water services that councils currently own. So you are absolutely right. There are private irrigation companies, for example, that are set up in multiple different forms that have their own provisions, largely under respective legislation. The water services as defined under the Local Government Act and what is defined in the Water Services Delivery Plan, that excludes those things, albeit there could be some crossover, and sorry, I'm not an expert in this area by any stretch of the imagination. There could be some crossover with things like the Taumata Arawai regulations and things like that, for water. So, that's quite different. And the private schemes, will be subject to regulation, but they're not talking about the private schemes here.
Okay, but would it be useful if we were able to have an example, perhaps? If we could email and actually ask the what were they actually had in mind when they started talking about this, and can they provide a real life example of where this might have?
We can certainly approach them. We have asked for clarification on another point, and we have received a response saying, look, while we're in consultation and working through the feedback, we're not entering into detailed discussions, but we can certainly approach them.
I just think there might be an unnecessary level of alarm around this, whereas if we knew a bit more about what the intent was, it might be reassuring.
Be very. So I will reach out to DIA.
Thank you.
Definitely. What I would say is just to really highlight that first point up there is around the water organisation must be wholly owned by one or more TAs and or consumer trust. So with that in mind, I don't believe this provision or set of provisions applies to us and any of the options that we're exploring. So, yeah.
All right, we can now go to the rest of the presentation.
Second last theme to share with you. So this one it is quite an operational slant, but I felt it was important to discuss with you because it has a operational slant and has a customer experience impact, we believe. So the bill currently includes provisions where if a water services provider requires entry to private land, so a residential property, the provider must have provided notice in writing at least 30 working days in advance and request the owner respond within 10 working days, notifying of any reasonable conditions to granting the consent. Where that agreement can't be landed, the responsibility for resolution through the district court, that would now shift to council, or the water services provider, rather than currently as it is with the owner. Okay, so if we think about the impact to our community and to the water customers, that this could result in delays, higher costs. It could result in poor customer experience and a fractured relationship with the water services provider, which is really what we do not want to do. And really and in our submission, we talk to the definition of reasonable being somewhat open to interpretation. So we do think that the powers of entry provision that's in the LGA are sufficient, they work well, and we think they should be retained and when we're talking about water and water services. So this is one that I think we will have a high interest in to see how it lands when the Act comes through. But of course, however that Act eventuates is what we would need to work to from about the middle of this year on, I would assume. Okay. So that's works on private land. Now the last one is an interesting one. So at the moment, the bill talks to how consultation must be undertaken where a change proposal is required. And it talks to that TAs must undertake consultation on a change proposal. Now, we need to remember here that when we're talking about the bill and if it passes into law unchanged, Wellington Water will automatically become a water organisation. And if that is the case, Wellington Water is our new baseline. And so transferring that to a new water organisation becomes a change proposal. And so it gets a little sticky. What we're doing is we're raising this with you because if you take the bill at face value, this would be a very challenging piece of legislation to work through between now and the end of the year. However, there has been some clarification provided by DIA to all councils, not just ourselves, and that the intent is that this set of provisions does only apply to once a new entity is stood up under the Water Services Preliminary Arrangements Act. However, the draft bill does not say that. So we're flagging this to you just from a transparency point of view, from a just-in-case point of view, but we do think the advice from DIA would mean that this wouldn't need to be a problem for us. It's an FYI more than anything. Okay, it's a bit of a gnarly one, and that is the end of the 7 major themes that we want, and plus this consultation one that we wanted to share with you. But as I say, you have the submission in full, and if you have a chance to look through that and you have further questions, I'm really happy to either sit down with you or have a more of a group conversation.
Thank you, Margot. And we do have a few questions for those last couple of slides. The first one being from Councillor Pannett.
Sorry, it wasn't exactly to do with private land, but what happens when people have work that they need done and they have an issue with the way that the water entity does it? And they could, and so they've been told they have to spend their own money. Is there going to be a route for complaints?
Yes, definitely, and that is one of the Commerce Commission's enhanced role and responsibilities as well, is that complaints and disputes process as well. But even before we get to that Commerce Commission layer, we would need to work through in the establishment of the organisation, whether it's go alone or with other councils, we would need to work through how would that look and roles and responsibilities, because to a certain degree, certainly in the transition period, I would think council would want to be, at least have some visibility of that as we transition to a smooth operation.
Thanks.
Councillor Free.
The 30 days working notice, what happens if there's sort of like a crisis and you need timeliness?
Yeah, exactly.
I actually think that's quite can we make the point that it should be related to the scale and the unexpectedness of the, like if a customer's actually requested some service, does this still apply, 30 days notice? And can we be more specific about the different sorts of things that might happen, like you have to enter someone's land to do something on behalf of someone else, to solve someone else's problem,
and
versus you're solving a problem which this particular homeowner's identified.
Exactly, and that is part of our concern, is it's not just a particular landowner or one piece of property. It might be we need access to that property to fix an issue 3 houses down. So, it does become quite complicated, and having this much rigour and prescription does become quite limiting. So that's why we think the provisions that are in the LGA work well. It means we can be far more responsive. It does mean the new organisation could be far more responsive as well. And that's, I think, what our ultimate goal is to be as responsive as possible and to fix issues as quickly as possible, and we need the mechanisms to support us to do that.
Is anything said about the interface between private plumbers and the work done by this new entity?
In the 300 odd sections that I think I recall, I don't believe so. I'm happy to have a look and follow that up, Councillor, but I don't believe so.
Yeah, it's just been one of the bit of a slight issue that's arisen this time. And can I ask one tiny little more? This consultation point that's made, does that mean the current consultation we're doing with our LTP would have to redo the whole thing?
Honestly, we don't think so. We do think the advice from DIA has clarified it, but taking the draft legislation at face value, you could interpret it that way, Councillor. But I do want to reiterate, DIA's position is that's not the intent of it. Yeah.
Mind you, to be honest, it might not be a bad thing. It's all changing so rapidly.
Councillor Rogers.
Yeah, my question was around whether there were any provisions across the 3 bills for the executive branch to issue secondary legislation alongside these 3 bills, or would all of those changes have to be done through Parliament?
Nothing comes to mind, but again, I'm happy to look into that, but I don't think there is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you, Margot, for all of the digesting.
The excitement that is.
Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Cheers.